Our speaker this evening is the former director of the Massachusetts Historical Society, and he's a professor at Northeastern University. He's written many books, the latest one being American Crisis, George Washington and the Dangers 2 years after Yorktown. And from what I've been reading, he's got all kinds of awards and everything. And so we're very, very honored this evening to have with us Professor William Fowler.
Book for sale.
I'm sorry.
This book is for sale back here.
Oh my gosh. Okay. Professor Fowler.
Thank you very much, Jane, for that lovely introduction. And the book is for sale. Jane is very kind in her remarks, but I'm always reminded that sometimes we're lifted up to be let low. I just finished teaching for the spring semester, and so I was reviewing my course evaluation students, and they looked pretty good. I came across one. The student had checked off all the right blocks. Good, 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 excellent. Then they said comments. The comments began, if I only had 2 days left on Earth, I'd want to spend them in Professor Fowler's class. And then I turned the page. And then I turned the page, and he went on and said, because Professor Fowler's classes last for eternity. So thank you, Jane. Let me begin this evening with a brief story. How does a historian become interested in a particular topic? How was it that I picked this particular subject, focused upon the Newburgh Address? As Jean mentioned, for some time, I was the director of the Massachusetts Historical Society in Boston. It is the oldest historical society in the United States. It has an incredible collection of manuscripts, some 12 million. Many of them, indeed, focused on the American Revolution. The papers of the early governors of Massachusetts, the Adams family papers, the papers of Thomas Jefferson. As the director of the society, of course, I had the keys to everything. And I used to love to wander the building, looking at these magnificent national treasures. Occasionally, of course, someone would ask me the question, if there were a fire in this building, what document would you look to save? And I always had an answer. It was a document that was located in the vault, carefully preserved. It was contained in a very neat leather folder. It was Washington's Newburgh Address in his own hand. And that document, I came to believe, marked the moment when the American Republic was saved. And so as I remained director, became ever more interested in that, and began to inquire and look, what has been written about this? I could find almost nothing. So I decided this was my task, was to write about this document. Many people believe that the American Revolution, it seems to be an echo, am I correct? Is this microphone interfering with this microphone? Are we ready? Can you hear me now? We often believe that the American Revolution ended with Lord Cornwallis' surrender at Yorktown, October 1781. That was not the case. The revolution would go on for 2 more years. There would be more battles. There would be considerably more diplomacy to take place. the war did not end. No one understood that better than the Commander-in-Chief. Although he rejoiced at the surrender of Cornwallis, he knew indeed that there was much left ahead. He wrote to Governor William Nelson of Virginia shortly after the battle, sharing with him his concerns. He suggested to Governor Nelson that instead of exciting our exertions, the victory at Yorktown will produce such a relaxation in the prosecution of the war as will prolong the calamities of it. A few days later, he wrote another letter, this time to General Nathaniel Greene, the American commander in the South. To General Greene, he wrote, "Congress may think our work closed and will fall into a state of languor and relaxation." Well, indeed they would if they had not already. Washington then returned to Mount Vernon with Martha. It was, by the way, only the second time he had been home during the entire Revolution. He spent a few days at home, and then he and Martha left for Philadelphia. It was his intention to spend the winter of 1781-82 with the Congress, trying to persuade them to remedy the evils that had come with the Revolution. In particular, they had neglected the Army. Washington arrived in Philadelphia, and as you can imagine, there were parties, toasts, endless banquets, even an opera written in his honor. He presented himself to the Congress and then left to attend to business. The Congress continued its deliberations to no particular end. But in the meantime, every Monday evening, at the home of Robert Morris, the financier of the Revolution, the treasurer, more or less, of the United States at that time, there at Robert Morris's home every Monday night, there was a dinner. Washington, Robert Morris, sometimes Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, General Benjamin Lincoln, the Secretary at War. These men discussed the matters of state. They discussed the dire situation. These were men who were in their minds and in their aims and goals nationalists. They saw the potential for a great nation, but they also saw the weakness of the men around them. There had been, for some time, no news from Paris. Our delegation had been there negotiating peace, but they had not reported anything. We knew discussions were going on, but knew little else. Was peace in the offing? No one knew for certain. What they did know, however, was that there was no money. The states had been issued requisitions, which in most instances they had neglected to fulfill. We survived on the largesse of the French. It was French gold that was keeping the revolution going. But in the meantime, American soldiers, and in particular officers, had not been paid. Washington, in March, returned to the body of Congress to ask their permission to depart. They gave them their permission, telling the Commander-in-Chief, "We have nothing particular to give you, and have appointed this audience only to assure you of our esteem and confidence, and to wish you happiness and success." Washington was on his way to rejoin his army. Shortly after Yorktown, the American army had decamped back to the banks of the Hudson River. They went to camp on the Hudson in order to monitor the British, who were still, and would remain for some time, in occupation of New York City. And so Washington then went north to rejoin the army in the area around Planks Point, West Point, and eventually Newbury. As he stood there with his men, watching the British, a new British Commander-in-Chief arrived. His name was Sir Guy Carleton. Sir Guy was a distinguished soldier. He had been Governor General of Canada before the Revolution, and indeed had hoped but did not receive the command in America. But he was now sent to New York to sort of clean up the mess. His orders were not to undertake any aggressive action. By this time, 1782. The British had come to the conclusion that the war was indeed over. The only thing that stood in the way of peace was a stubborn king who refused to acknowledge American independence. But at the same time, the forces in power, the political opposition to the war in Parliament had grown and grown. And so Sir Guy Carleton was sent on the unhappy task of being the last commander-in-chief. He was to continue to occupy the city, but not to do anything else. In the midst of this, as Washington tried to maintain command and morale amongst his men, Sir Guy trying to do the same in New York City, Washington received an astounding letter. It came from Colonel Lewis Nicola. Colonel Nicola had been a professional British officer before the Revolution. He indeed had actually written a manual of arms for the Continental Army. He was a distinguished and well-recognized soldier. He was now in command of the Regiment of Invalids. These were men who, through injury, combat, had become unwell, not able to serve in the line, but still physically able to stand guard duty, to act as teamsters and logistics, things that support facilities. Colonel Nicola knew the cost of war firsthand in his command of these men. He knew what they had endured and what they had suffered. Colonel Nicola wrote to his commander-in-chief, "Sir, when this war is over, we who have borne the heat and labor of the day will be forgotten and neglected. The Army will not submit to this grave injustice. From several conversations I have had with officers, I believe it is generally intended not to separate after the peace till all our grievances are addressed, engagements and promises fulfilled. This war must have shown to all, but to military men in particular, the weakness of republics." Washington was stunned at the letter. Ordinarily, when the commander-in-chief received communications, he assigned them to his secretaries, and a response would be forthcoming in a few days. Washington drafted a response to Colonel Nicola within minutes. He replied to the colonel, "I have read your letter with a mixture of surprise and astonishment. No occurrence in the course of this war has given me more painful sensations than your information that there being such ideas existing in the Army." He promised Nicola that he would see to the Army's grievances, but in a constitutional way. A few days later, Washington received another letter, this time from Major General James Mitchell Barnum. General Barnum had been a Continental Army officer. He was from Rhode Island. He had also served in the Continental Congress. General Barnum wrote to the commander-in-chief, "The Congress is a baseless fabric. My fellow citizens are totally destitute of that love and equality which is absolutely requisite to support a republic. Only an absolute monarchy or a military state can alone save us from the horrors of subjugation." Washington did not respond directly to General Barnum, but he did a few days later write to General Benjamin Lincoln. Lincoln was the Secretary at War, ostensibly the civilian in charge of the Army and Washington's superior. Washington wrote to General Barnum, who described the condition of his men. "If these men who have spent the flower of their days in establishing the freedom and independence of their country are sent home without one farthing of money, great discontents will arise. The patience and long sufferance of this army are almost exhausted." Washington was particularly concerned as the summer turned towards fall. He was concerned because his army was about to go into winter quarters. I suspect I do not need to spend a lot of time with this audience to describe to you the Continental Army's experiences in winter quarters. But at the end of each of those periods of quarters, there had always been a spring offensive. There had always been a continuation of the war. There was reason to suffer. Valley Forge and Morristown. But now, there would be an end to this war. Why should these men go through winter quarters when there would be no spring offensive? Washington was deeply concerned about keeping up the morale of his men. He was deeply concerned about what he had heard from Nicole, what he had heard from Brown, about the rumors he had heard in camp about mutiny. How would he get these men through the winter? For if the army collapsed in the winter, General Carleton was still, and the British were still in control of New York. The British Navy still ruled the seas. The British had beaten back the French in other parts of the world. They had not lost the war. If the Americans should collapse now, the Republic would collapse. In the midst of his worries, another worry arrived at the encampment. This was General Horatio Gates. General Gates and General Washington had a long and unhappy relationship. You may recall that General Gates in 1777 was the victor at Saratoga, one of the great American victories of the war. He was a national hero. That same year, 1777, saw Washington at Brandywine, Germantown, and the loss of Philadelphia. His star was falling and Gates was rising. There were rumors in the Congress. Conspiracy, not certain, but certainly rumors that perhaps Gates would make a better commander than Washington. Among those, by the way, who suggested this was Samuel Adams and some of the other old radicals and revolutionaries. Washington, of course, heard these rumors. Gates would later deny that he had any part in any conspiracy or plot. No one really believed him. General Gates was then later posted to command the army in the South, where he completely, totally disgraced himself at the Battle of Yorktown. Terrible American defeat. Gates' disgrace came from the fact that as soon as the smoke cleared from the battlefield, General Gates couldn't be found. He was 50 or 60 miles away, reorganizing, he said, reorganizing. He was dismissed from his command and kept in a sort of limbo for some time. Until finally, early in 1782, the Congress, without consulting with the Commander-in-Chief, assigned General Gates to be the senior general at the American encampment at Newburgh. They sent General Gates to General Washington, telling General Washington that he may use the general as he sees fit. General Gates was, in fact, the commander of the army at the Newburgh encampment. Washington, as commander-in-chief, did not hold direct command of the army. So Gates set up his headquarters in a place called Ellison House, not far from Newburgh and very close to the army's encampment. Here is a moment when historians are to see some of the places they're writing about. And so in the course of my research, I visited Newburgh, spent some considerable time there, and went, in fact, to Ellison House, which is part of the state historical park. Ellison House is a lovely house, as they say, built in the Dutch style. Stone house, 4 rooms down, 4 rooms up, and barns attached. This was Gates' headquarters. General Gates was here, along with several secretaries, aides-de-camps, along with his personal guard, along with cooks and servants, and, by the way, the Ellison family. They never left. It was a crowded place. One could see it just walking through. And I mention this because later, things would happen in Ellison House, and I'll describe to you. And General Gates would later say, I knew nothing. I knew nothing. Visit Ellison House and imagine how could he not have known what was going on. They were stumbling over one another. It was important to see the physical place to get a sense of what was going on. To keep up the morale of the army, Washington sent his men to hutting. They built huts, wooden huts, all over the open fields there at Newburgh. Some 7,000 American soldiers and about 600 huts for one brief moment. The American encampment at Newburgh was one of the largest towns in America. When they had finished building the huts, what to do next? They built roads, constructed fences, on, day after day, drilling, doing more busy work, keeping the men busy because there was little else for them to do. And you can imagine the conversations in the huts in the evening as the men retired about pay, about going home, about not knowing what was going to happen in the spring. The officers, too, were discontented. A group of officers came to Washington, and they asked the general if they might write a memorial to Congress. Washington had always been very careful, very cautious about his relationship with the Congress, and he had always done everything that he could to keep his officers from any relationship with the Congress as well. The military and the civilian government were separate. But he understood the situation, and so he gave his consent. And a group of officers, representing all the other officers at the encampment, began to write a memorial, which they would deliver in person to the Congress. When they had finished the memorial, they assigned it to 3 officers to deliver. Colonel Elias Ogden from New Jersey, Colonel John Brooks from Massachusetts, and Major General Alexander McDougal from New York. These 3 men were given a memorial to deliver it in person to the Congress. They arrived and visited the Congress January the 6th, 1783. It was a memorial. They asked the Congress, as their head and sovereign, to hear our plea. We have borne all that men can bear. Further experiments on our patients may have fatal effects. These officers spent quite a bit of time meeting with members of Congress informally. Among those they met with, Robert Morris, his assistant, Gouverneur Morris, who was not a member of Congress, but a high member of the Treasury Department. They also met with some young men in Congress, James Madison from Virginia, Alexander Hamilton from New York. These were men who I mentioned before had a national view. The Congress was divided into factions. There were those in the Congress, such as Samuel Adams and the Lees from Virginia, who viewed the war in the spirit of the old revolution. They were state rights people. They were there as Virginians, as Massachusetts people. They didn't gather together to form a nation. Others had a different view. The nationalists realized that the Congress was powerless, and that there was a real danger that if the needs of the army were not attended to, if there were not a stronger national government, that this infant republic would collapse. We may become independent, but we would have become independent as several nations, not one. How then to gain strength in the Congress? These men and some army officers began now to play a dangerous game. The game was to use the army as a lever against the Congress, as a threat to force the Congress to bring the states into closer unitedness. Gouverneur Morris was the chief among these, and Gouverneur Morris realized what they all knew, that the chief threat to their plans to strengthen the Congress, the chief threat was peace. It was peace. It was war that held them together. Should peace arrive, at what point is this union? Gouverneur Morris wrote to his friend, Mr. Reynolds. He wrote, "Not much for the interest of America that peace should be made at present." They were in a race. While they knew nothing specific about what was going on in Paris, certainly they knew rumors, and it was a race. Could they strengthen the Congress first, or would peace arrive first? Which would happen? They became somewhat anxious and almost desperate. And so these men in Philadelphia began to communicate with their commanders of the army. Gouverneur Morris was was assigned the task of writing to General Henry Knox. Henry Knox was Washington's oldest and closest friend in the Army. He had been with his commander since the very first days. Knox was the commander of the American Artillery, and at the present moment he was the commander at West Point. He was a critical and key figure. And so Gouverneur Morris was assigned the task to write to General Knox, entice the general, to sound out the general. Morris wrote, "My dear friend, will you join with the Congress to press the states? The Army may now influence the legislatures, and if you will permit me a metaphor from your own profession, after you have carried the post, the public creditors will garrison it for you." To write to General Washington, these men turned to Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton and Washington had a tortured relationship. Hamilton was a bastard by birth. He had come to New York early in his career, just arriving before the Revolution. War broke out, he joined the Army, distinguished himself first as a captain of artillery, and eventually rose to the rank of colonel. Washington recognized this young man's skill and ability, and so he invited him to be one of his aides, one of his secretaries. On one particular occasion, at headquarters, the commander-in-chief was coming down the stairs, and Colonel Hamilton was going up the stairs. The commander-in-chief said, "Colonel, I wish your presence immediately." The colonel replied, "I'll be with you in a few minutes, sir." That was the wrong response. The very wrong response. Washington upbraided the colonel. Hamilton felt humiliated and left. Later he will rejoin the Army. He serves at Yorktown under General Lafayette, and again distinguishes himself. Left the Army and was elected to the Congress from New York. Hamilton knows Washington very well. Very well. And so Hamilton is given the task to inquire the general. He invited the general, told the general there was discontent in the Army. He suggested that it was the commander-in-chief's task, mission, to, quote, guide a torrent. That there was a torrent, but he and only he should guide it. He also said, he wrote to Washington, something that deeply distressed the commander-in-chief. He told Washington that there were rumors in the Army that he, Washington, had not spoken out forcefully enough on behalf of the officers and the enlisted men. Washington was dumbfounded, offended. For if there's one thing that he took pride in, it was that he had always been with his officers and his men. He was stunned at this news. It would be a few days before either Knox or Washington would reply. And here again, a bit of speculation. West Point is about 12 miles from the Newburgh encampment, Washington's headquarters. Washington and Knox were very close friends. Their wives were very close friends. It doesn't take much to imagine that Knox and Washington talked about the letters they had just received from Philadelphia and about how to respond to these letters. And they did respond. Knox responded first to Morris. To his friend he wrote, "I consider the reputation of the American Army as one of the most immaculate things on earth. We should even suffer wrongs and injuries to the utmost verge of toleration rather than sully it in the least degree. I hope in God that the Army will never be directed against the enemies of the liberties of America." A few days later, Washington responded to Hamilton. "Sir, the fatal tendency to involve the Army in political matters would be productive of civil commotion and end in blood. I stand as citizen and soldier. Note the order of those words. I stand as citizen and soldier. Well, the news from Newark wasn't good. And so the men in Philadelphia now have to go to Plan B. Plan B. General Gates. General Gates was a bit of a trimmer, not to be trusted, exactly the kind of person they wanted. Gates had around him at Ellison House a young staff. The staff was Christopher Richmond, William Barber, and John Armstrong. Richmond, Barber, and Armstrong, young men, young officers, eager, ambitious, reckless. They began, and let me be cautious here, there is no smoking gun. I have no correspondence where General Gates says, yes, I was there. I have lots of correspondence with other people that say he was there, part of this, but I have none of that. But I do have my visit to Ellison House, where these three officers, along with other people, and General Gates were all crowded together. So again, for General Gates to say, yeah, I can know these three guys are doing. It seems to me a problem. There arrives in camp at Ellison House Colonel Walter Stewart, fresh from Philadelphia. Gates responds that Colonel Stewart, a friend of ours, arrives with information from Philadelphia. Stewart arrived on Saturday, March the 8th, 1783. Stewart reports to Gates and to the other officers what has happened in Congress, the mood of Congress, the press and part of the nationalists. They have long conversations about this, about the role of the Army. Saturday, the 8th. Monday morning, the 10th. An anonymous address, rather lengthy, appears in the camp. Now, again, think for a moment as historians. Stewart arrives on the 8th. This rather long announcement comes out to public on the 10th, Monday morning. What were they doing Sunday? They were writing this address. And in particular, Colonel John Armstrong was writing. We know that because it's in his hand. But he didn't write it alone. He had help from the other officers, perhaps Gates, I don't know. The announcement begins, gentlemen, a fellow soldier whose interest and affections bind him strongly to you, whose past sufferings have been as great and whose future fortunes may be as desperate as yours, would beg leave to address you. Will Congress address our wrongs, or will they trample on our rights? If peace comes and we put down our swords, what then? If peace comes and we put down our swords, what then? The announcement concluded by saying we're going to have a meeting tomorrow, Tuesday, March the 11th, all of the officers to discuss these measures. As soon as Washington saw this, he swung into action. He immediately issued a general order that there would be no meeting on Tuesday. There simply would be no meeting. However, he said, we will have a meeting on the 15th, on Saturday the 15th. Here, Washington understands the precariousness of this situation. A meeting has been called without his consent. That alone is a violation of the Articles of War. Right then and there, Washington could have rightfully have arrested the officers who wrote this broadside, but he did not. Why didn't he move in that direction? He wasn't sure he could trust them. He wasn't sure that he could trust the Army. The meeting will take place on Saturday, he said, and the senior officer present will preside. The senior officer present will be General Gates. The next day, on the 11th, another address appears. policy house. The general is with us. We're going to have a meeting. It doesn't matter when he cancels the one on Tuesday. See, he's with us. We're going to have a meeting. Well, I've been through the correspondence in Washington with these other gentlemen. I cannot begin to imagine what that week must have been like at Washington's headquarters. Washington knows what's going to happen on the 15th. How Gates presiding over this meeting. He has with him among his staff one of his aides, Colonel Jonathan Trumbull. Trumbull is a fine writer, a very fine writer. I personally am convinced that the next several days, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, they have prepared the most important speech that Washington will ever give. And Trump is there. Saturday morning, the 15th, the officers troop up to the assembly point in the middle of the encampment, a large building called the Temple of Virtue. They take their seats, benches, about 300 of them. And then General Gates enters from the back room. The officers come to attention. General Gates moves to the center of the room, tells the officers to take their seats, which they do. He then begins to convene the meeting. And as he's convening the meeting, the sound of hoofs outside, the rattle of sabers, is Washington and his bodyguard. The general entered the room. By the way, he was made for the part. He's about 6'2", built like a linebacker. He is from central casting when it comes to what the commander-in-chief looks like. As soon as he entered the room, of course, the men snapped to attention again, all eyes turned towards the commander-in-chief. This is totally, completely unexpected. General Gates himself has a rather surprised look on his face. The general walked to the front of the room. General Gates stepped aside, and Washington took command of the meeting. After a few preliminaries, he began to address the officers. He told them first, "Gentlemen, you must forgive me. I must read this speech." Ordinarily, he would not have read a speech, he would have read a few remarks. The officers are also stunned to see their commander-in-chief because this has never happened before. Washington has never summoned his officers to speak to them. Oh, they had staff meetings, to be sure. But this is unprecedented for the commander-in-chief to address all his officers. It's a moment. It is a moment. And so he begins to take out of his pocket the address and begins to read it. "Gentlemen, by an anonymous summons, an attempt has been made to convene you together. How inconsistent with the rules of propriety, how unmilitary, and how subversive of all order and discipline. Let the good sense of the army decide." He then goes on to explain his role in this war. "Thus much, gentlemen, I have thought it incumbent on me to observe to you, to show upon what principles I oppose the irregular and hasty meeting which was proposed to have been held on Tuesday last. And not because I wanted a disposition to give you every opportunity consistent with your own honor and the dignity of the army to make known your grievances. If my conduct heretofore has not evinced to you that I have been a faithful friend to the army, my declaration of it at this time will be equally unavailing and improper. But I was among the first to embark in the cause of our common country, as I have never left your side one moment, but when called from you on public duty, as I have been the constant companion and witness of your distresses, and not among the last to feel your distresses of the army, as my heart has ever expanded with joy when I have heard his praises, and my indignation has arisen when the mouth of detraction has been opened against him. It can scarcely be supposed at this late stage of the war that I am indifferent exert whatever ability I am possessed of in your favor. Let me entreat you, gentlemen, on your part, not to take any measures which, viewed in the calm light of reason, will lessen the dignity and sully the glory you have hitherto maintained. Let me request you to rely on the plighted faith of your country and place a full confidence in the purity of the intentions of Congress, that previous to your dissolution as now, they will cause all your accounts to be fairly liquidated as directed in their resolutions, which were published to you 2 days ago, and that they will adopt the most effectual measures in their power to render ample justice to you for your faithful and meritorious service. And let me conjure you, in the name of our common country, as you value your own sacred honor, as you respect the rights of humanity, and as you regard the military and national character of America, to express your utmost horror and detestation of the man who wishes, under any specious pretenses, to overturn the liberties of our country, and who wickedly attempts to open the floodgates of civil discord and deluge our rising empire in blood. By thus determining and thus acting, you will pursue the plain and direct road to the attainment of your wishes. You will defeat the insidious designs of our enemies, who are compelled to resort from open force to secret artifice. You will give one more distinguished proof upon example of patriotism and patient virtue, rising superior to the pressure of the most complicated sufferings. And you will, by the dignity of your conduct, afford occasion for posterity to say, when speaking of the glorious example you have exhibited to mankind, had this day been wanting, the world has never seen the last stage of perfection to which human nature is capable of attaining. He then finished, and it was a dreadful moment. Major Samuel Shaw, who was present, later recorded that moment. Every eye was fixed upon the illustrious man, and attention to their beloved general held the assembly mute. Mute. Washington was concerned that they hadn't heard him. They were mute. There was no response. He then paused for a moment, and he reached into his pocket, and he pulled out a letter. It was a letter from Joseph Jones, Congressman from Virginia. It was a letter that Jones had written to Washington to assure him of the Congress's faith, no pay the army, etc. It was a very profound letter. Washington took the letter out and began to read. He stumbled over some words. He reached into his pocket. And here, a great historic revelation to him. The whole question about whether Washington planned this event, whether he had written the address, was this spontaneous, was now sort of answered. 2 weeks before, Washington wrote to David Rittenhouse in Philadelphia. Rittenhouse was a scientist, astronomer, and an eyeglass maker. He wrote to David Rittenhouse to say, Mr. Rittenhouse, thank you very much for the glasses. And then he said something perhaps that might resonate with some of you. He said, I'm trying to get used to them. He had never worn them. And so when he took these glasses out and put them on, again, the men were struck. They'd never seen the commander-in-chief wearing glasses. But also something else. He didn't wear the glasses when he read his address. He didn't have to. A few moments ago, I told you about my experience in historical study. But that document, that's what documents are supposed to be for. That document was written in his own hand. So now it sort of became clear to me. On Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Jonathan Trumbull wrote the original draft. Address, because the original draft is in the Library of Congress, Washington papers, and it's clearly in Jonathan Trumbull's hand. It's a neat hand, as 18th century secretaries had, but it's, just normal writing. The Newburgh Address that I would hold in my hands all the time was in Washington's big scroll, in a very large hand. Glasses, large scroll. Yes. So what happened there? I'm convinced that Trumbull and Company and Washington wrote out the address, and then Trumbull made the fair copy, as they call it. Washington looked at that fair copy and said, I don't think that. So maybe Washington did an all-nighter Friday night. But at some point, in his own hand, he recopied that speech so that he would be able to deliver it in person and be able to read it. Oh, he planned this all right. And when he took his glasses out, because now he was reading Joseph Jones's letter, which was in Joseph Jones's hands, so he couldn't read it with his glasses on. He remarked to the officer's president, "Gentlemen, you must forgive me. For my hair has grown gray, and my eyes have grown dim in the service of my country. Not a dry eye in the house." Shaw recorded that moment, too. The officers sat in silence. Some openly wept. He stood alone, not at the head of his troops, but as it were in opposition to them. And for a dreadful moment, the interests of the army and its general seemed to be in competition. He spoke, every doubt was dispelled, and the tide of patriotism rolled in its wonted course. He finished Jones's letter, put it back in his pocket, and walked out. Immediately, General Knox rose and moved several resolutions in support of the general and the Congress. A committee was immediately appointed. They went to the back room, and 20 minutes later came back with the resolutions. I think that was planned. The resolutions were passed. Congress was supported, and the news was sent to Congress. The news, Newburgh, the news that the general had kept control, the news that the army was remaining loyal, arrived at almost the same moment that a ship arrived in Philadelphia from France. Good news. Peace. Peace. The king, that stubborn George III, had finally consented to independence, and a preliminary draft treaty had been signed. There were some things left to do now. Tidy up. Had to be the British evacuation of New York. The British would not leave New York until finally November the 25th, 1783. They kind of dragged their heels a bit. Washington goes down to join the Congress and stays with them for a while. And then the Congress moves to Annapolis. They were more or less chased off. And it's while they're in Annapolis that Washington has one final duty to perform. One final task. He rides to Annapolis to deliver to them, to the Congress, what they had given to him in June of 1775. When they had appointed him Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, they had literally given him his commission, which he carried with him all through the war. He now returned to Annapolis, to the Congress, and in a brief but very touching ceremony, he returned his commission to the Congress. And then went home to Mount Vernon. Steven Spielberg couldn't have done it better because he arrives at Mount Vernon Christmas Eve, 1783. A few days later, he wrote to one of his friends how good it was to be home, and that never again would he be in public service. The world has seen, does see, will see lots of revolutions. Revolutions are wonderful at destroying governments. They're not very good at building them. I don't know why some revolutions work and others don't, but I think I know why ours work and theirs don't. We had Washington, and they did not. Thank you very much. I'll repeat the question.
One second, I'm sorry. Could you talk a little bit about what Morris's use in terms of leveraging
Robert
leveraging Army against Congress? What was his intention to do?
Since the ultimate leverage would be to turn the Army against the states, for the Army to demand, to march on the states and demand that the states supply the Congress with the money. That was the ultimate. And in point of fact, during the course of the American Revolution, they have documented, by the way, somewhere in the order of 40 or 50 mutinies. So there were many times, and in June of 1783, in fact, the Congress gets chased out of Philadelphia. One reason it gets chased out of Philadelphia is that there's a mutiny in the Pennsylvania line. So there was ample reason for Washington and the other officers to be concerned, but it was to get the states to put up the money. I might add, by this time, the French had become thoroughly disenchanted with this. And there were interesting letters, correspondence. Robert Morris always wanted to get more money from the French. And the French minister said to Robert Morris, why, I'm paraphrasing, but this is in 1782, early 83, the French minister says, why should my king be sending you money when your states won't send you money? And so the French were leaving. And the states had not continued not to put up the money. Only from the states could the Congress get money. That was the only source of money. Only source. The Congress had no property tax. It was the only source of money. Yes, sir.
When did the men finally get paid?
That's always a good question. When did the men finally get paid? It took a very long time in bits and pieces. When they finally, by the way, as soon as peace was declared, the Army did peacefully and in an orderly fashion. They all went home. But some went home with a little bit of money. Robert Morris provided some money, some fraction of money. They went home with what we might call IOUs, promises to pay. They were also compensated with land bounties. So there were a number of different kinds of ways that the officers and men, by the way, were compensated. The states did compensate their men to some degree. The last Pension Act for the American Revolution veterans was signed by John Quincy Adams in 1828. So it took a long time. And as you probably know, students of American history, that many of the pieces of paper that the revolutionary veterans were given, these, shall we call them IOUs, they took home with them. And these pieces of paper depreciated rapidly because who was going to pay them, who was going to buy them. And that became part of the whole concept, the whole controversy in the early reform of funding and assumption, where the federal government agreed to take on its own shares all of the obligations that all the states had incurred during the American Revolution. But it's a long, tortured tale, and not a very pleasant one, by the way. The veterans who came home, well, again, I mentioned some of this in my book. Many of the states viewed these men asking for money as it was outrageous. They thought it was outrageous that they should ask for money. They should be asking for their salaries, that they should have been serving for the honor and patriotism of it all. So the American soldiers and those who came home after the Revolution were not highly honored. Again, just as a side, one of the reasons for the establishment of the Society in Cincinnati, for the officers of the Society in Cincinnati, an organization. To be a member, you must be a direct descendant of a Continental Army officer. But that society was established in May of 1783, in great measure, to be a lobbying effort on the part of the officers to get their rightful compensation. Yes,
my friend Todd and I are members of the Society of Cincinnati. It's interesting to do with the story about McDougal, and I share this with my friends who went to the New York Society. About McDougal, it's interesting, we did a field trip last month to the Museum of American Finance, and it had quite a coincidence that up on the wall there was a mural that had Alexander McDougal, because I was familiar with the story that he Congress was free for money. So I thought that was quite ironic, and I don't know why he's up there, but maybe he's unappreciated that irony. I don't know. My question is, with this book, both you and Tom Fleming now have written a book about the same time period, and both of you have gotten great reviews for covering this period that most people haven't thought of. Could you compare and contrast your two books?
there is no comparison. Next question.
In the sense of Washington removing his glasses when he was leaving New York at the last meeting, a farewell meeting with his officers, same situation.
You mean at Francis Tavern? I don't recall the glasses playing a role. That was the moment when he gathered. There weren't too many officers who showed up. Hamilton was not there. I don't remember this is at Francis Tavern, the very end of Washington, after the evacuation of New York. Guy Carlton finally leaves November 25th, and a few days later at Francis Tavern in New York, Washington reads summonses that the officers were present there to say goodbye to them. Very emotional point. Interestingly enough, again, as people obviously interested in history, that moment, Washington's farewell to his officers at Francis Tavern, you would have thought that everybody who was there would have written about it. There's only one source by a major television. He's the only person who wrote about that event, and he wrote about it many years later. It's always fascinating. Perhaps those documents are lost. But one of the, because his event is repeated in photographs, paintings, etc., many, many times. But there's only one source to describe that event, and it's one of the Yes?
With great scholarship, could you project forward to 1783 to 1787? You mentioned the growing partnership between Madison and Hamilton.
Yeah.
Could you go to give us some history, take us forward? Because without that, we wouldn't have the United States of America.
Yes.
We wouldn't have the Annapolis Convention. We wouldn't have the Philadelphia Patrick Henry meeting that you'd never go to.
Yeah.
Educate us.
That's
Fast
very
forward
true.
ahead to how we got to the finish line.
My first recommendation, talking about those years, in my book in the appendix, I included Washington's circular letter to the states in June 1783. It's a fascinating document. This is the letter which foreshadows much of the federal Constitution. So you can see in 1783, Washington had much on his mind about the future of the nation. There's sometimes a bit of mythology that somehow when Washington goes home, Christmas Eve 1783, he joins Martha at Mount Vernon, and they have to drag it back into public life. That's really not true. It's really not true. So Washington remains, wrote that letter in June 1783. He remains very much up to speed in the next few years about what's going on. He's very much in the center of things. And Madison and Hamilton become, of course, engines of the Constitutional Convention and then later. But there is very clearly the nationalists in the Congress. You can almost follow a genealogy. That the men in the Congress in 1781, 82, 83 who are promoting and pushing the stronger Congress are the same voices that speak in 84, 85, 86, and then 87. It is continuous. There's no break. There's a continuous thing.
Two more questions.
Okay.
That's it.
I'm exhausted. Yes, sir.
These people, from Cleveland to the debacle, then to somehow he seems to come back.
Yes, because he does. It's like Richard Nixon. In fact, Gates lives a long life, by the way. He doesn't die. He takes up residence in New York City in the years after the Revolution. And you could read his correspondence and the correspondence from others to him, and you get a sense that he was part of this. He knew what was going on. But yes, he's like one of those dogs that keeps coming back. He was an able commander. There's no question about that. Not a king, but certainly at Saratoga. And he's a man of great prestige. And yes, but he does keep coming back. Wow. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much. I don't know if you all enjoyed it as much as I did, but I Yes, and don't forget the books, baby. Mine were right here. Don't forget, we get there on time. Now, it's time for our trivia. So, are you all ready? Okay. Trivia.
trivial person. This is a tough act to follow. Do justice to his character. Okay, number one question. Our Liberty Bell, am I right?
That's good.
Our Liberty Bell was commissioned by the city of Philadelphia to be hung in the city hall. Can anyone tell me when it was first cast and by whom? It contains a biblical quotation. I think it's to proclaim liberty throughout the land, something like that. I don't remember where the source was at. Check. Correct? That's exactly right. It was first cast in 1752 by London bell makers Pass and Stowe. It cracked almost at once when it arrived in Philadelphia and was returned for recasting. It was recast the following year in 1753, and it is this date that is imprinted on the bell. It lasted 82 years until 1835, when it developed a large crack while being rung for the funeral of Chief Justice John Marshall at the time. Everybody seems to think that the Liberty Bell, dates from 1776. No, it dated quite a bit before that. And I wonder what the source of liberty, the intent was about the liberty quotation. I have no idea. Does anyone else know that? No, okay. You're as ignorant as I am.
Oh,
I'm sorry.
It had to do with the anniversary of William Penn's proclamation of liberties
In
in
Pennsylvania?
Pennsylvania, yes.
huh.
Therefore proclaim liberty throughout all the
That is a
land.
good question. Thank you, Tom. Tom Winslow's the source of that. On June 28, 1776, 1 week before the signing of the Declaration of Independence, American coastal artillery successfully repulsed a British naval attack on what American city? Charleston, which was known at that time as Charlestown. Right, okay. Very good. As of November 25th, 1783, Evacuation Day in New York City, what was unusual about the physical appearance of Manhattan Island?
Burnt to the ground.
Not burned to the ground.
No
It was
trees.
burned to the ground, yes, and not restored.
No trees.
It was virtually treeless. There were young trees growing, but nothing worthwhile. All the wood on the entire Manhattan Island had been consumed in an effort to get warm since the British occupied the island. Okay. After the battles of Lexington and Concord on April 19, 1775, just give me an idea about your thoughts about the casualties that were inflicted upon the retreating 700-man column by Massachusetts militiamen. Any idea how many they suffered?
Not too many.
No, not more. It comes to 273 killed, wounded, and missing. That was 39% of the column was rendered unuseful anymore. Americans, in the meantime, suffered a mere 93 casualties. Named the only man who signed all 4 of America's founding documents. There are 4.
Benjamin Franklin.
Roger Sherman is correct. Very good. Okay. The delegate from Connecticut signed the Articles of Association, which was the first document when Congress first got together. Okay. The Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, and the Constitution. Very good. At the Battle of Bunker Hill, or Breed's Hill, on June 17, 1775, how many frontal assaults did General Howe's British troops make before they overcame the defending Americans? 3. It was the 3rd attack. It took them 3 attacks. The casualties were horrific. I don't think the British suffered any worse casualties in the war. Okay. Here's one. What 2 states were the last to ratify the Constitution?
Rhode Island and North Carolina.
Correct. You got man a box of stickers.
No, I'm researching it.
North Carolina and Rhode Island, and they both finally ratified the Constitution long after the American government began to operate under its terms.
Under threat of war.
Yes, that's correct.
Guns.
Okay, New Jersey began its life, now this is pre-revolutionary. New Jersey began its life as two separate proprietorships in the early 1600s. They were called the Jerseys. East Jersey and West Jersey with separate administrations. What present-day highway was the boundary between the two, and when did they unite? Route 202. Present Route 202. If you go north to south on Route 202, you'll see the original wall. In many cases, the wall is still there, the stone wall. Okay, and they finally united in what year? Any idea? 1702. Boy, you're smarter than you look. What two present day, this is a toughie, what two present day New England states were part of the original, were not part of the original 13 colonies?
Vermont and Maine.
Vermont and Maine, very good. Okay, Vermont was admitted in 1791 as the 14th state, right after the 13 were, agglomerated there. Now how about Maine?
1820.
1820 was finally admitted. It separated from the Massachusetts colony or state in 1819, and then finally was admitted to the Union in 1820.
Missouri Compromise.
Here's one for you. What military blunder did George Washington make at the Battle of Bunker Hill?
He wasn't there. He was not there.
It's a trick. He wasn't even there. Okay. Having been officially confirmed by the American commander by Congress on June the 15th, 2 days before the battle. So he wasn't even there. So if you said nothing, you were quite right. And the last one, what document published on January 10th, 1776 is said to have influenced more fence-straddling colonists to the cause of independence than any other argument? Common Sense by Thomas Paine. Incidentally, if you haven't read it, read it. Very interesting document. Okay. Very good. Okay, you did very well. May I admonish you, please, to return your